The fluorescent lights buzzed above like angry hornets, and the stale air of the congressional hearing room seemed to pulse with tension. You could almost taste the static in the air, that burnt coffee and old paper tang that clung to government buildings like an unwelcome ghost. Reporters leaned forward in their seats, pens poised above notebooks, fingers hovering over keys. Cameras hummed quietly on their tripods. It had been a long day already, 4 hours into the hearing, and most of the room was bored stiff. That was until the shouting started. It was sudden, loud, sharp, and jarring enough that heads snapped up like startled deer. Senator Tim Scott, usually the picture of calm conservatism, was no longer sitting. He stood at the edge of his desk, eyes narrowed and jaw clenched, his voice rising like thunder cracking across a too quiet sky. "Congresswoman, I have listened to enough of your sanctimony and condescension. You're not here to solve problems. You're here to grandstand." The room froze. It wasn't just what he said, it was the way he said it. His voice cracked with fury, and his fist hit the wood of the desk, echoing like a gavel. Tim Scott, the hopeful presidential contender who'd built his image on dignity and quiet resilience, had erupted, and everyone saw it. At the receiving end sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, her mahogany skin glowing softly under the sterile light, her posture impossibly still. She blinked once, then twice. She didn't flinch, didn't recoil. Instead, she inhaled long and deep, her fingers gently smoothing the pleats of her navy blazer. Her voice, when it came, was calm, low, almost tender. "Senator, I understand that the truth can be uncomfortable, but I didn't come here to argue. I came here to represent the people who have gone unheard for too long. If my words sting, perhaps it's not the tone, but the content." The silence that followed was thicker than cement. But let's rewind for a moment, because this wasn't just a random outburst. No, this was the climax of a storm long brewing, driven by two people with lives shaped by pressure, loss, and the stubborn hope that they could change a system not built for them. Timothy Eugene Scott had grown up in North Charleston, South Carolina, a son of a single mother who worked 16-hour days as a nurse's aide just to keep the lights on. He knew what hunger felt like, what hopelessness looked like in his friends' eyes, what it meant to come home to an empty fridge and a mother too exhausted to cry anymore. He dreamed not of riches, but of respect, of standing in a room full of white, wealthy men and not feeling small. He chased order, discipline, and control. Politics, for him, was a way to beat the odds, a ladder out of chaos. But the higher he climbed, the more he feared losing the foundation of who he was. That fear festered. He learned to hide it behind polished speeches and photo ops. Still, every time someone accused him of forgetting where he came from, it cut him like a knife. Jasmine's words that day had been surgical. Jasmine Crockett, on the other hand, was fire in silk, born and raised in scent. Louis, Missouri, she was the daughter of educators who taught her the power of words and the necessity of resistance. She became a civil rights attorney, defending protesters and taking on cases others ran from. She didn't enter Congress to play nice. She came with a purpose: to say the unsayable, to name names, to hold power accountable even when her voice trembled. She didn't fear backlash, she feared silence. The committee hearing was supposed to be a routine oversight session on criminal justice reform. But under the surface, it was a battlefield of unspoken grievances and conflicting visions of what progress really meant for Black Americans. The spark, a proposed amendment that would divert funding from community reinvestment programs to boost policing technology. Jasmine opposed it vehemently. Tim supported it with measured enthusiasm. That morning, Jasmine had delivered a quiet, passionate statement, pointing out how these policies, however well intentioned, often ended up harming the very communities they claimed to help. Her words weren't angry, but they were direct. Too often, she said, we are asked to accept bandages instead of cures. We deserve more than the illusion of safety. We deserve justice. Tim had felt it like a slap. He heard in her voice the echo of people who thought he'd sold out, who didn't know how many nights he'd stayed up questioning whether compromise was cowardice or courage. When he finally exploded, it wasn't just at Jasmine. It was at everything he'd buried for years, but Jasmine didn't bite. Instead, she spoke with grace and clarity, like someone who had learned that the most powerful tool in a fight is restraint. And as her words unfurled, her voice steady, her eyes unwavering, something shifted in the room. It's easy to yell when you feel unheard, she said softly. But I don't believe you're my enemy, Senator. I think we both want a better future. We just see different roads to get there, and I don't need to scream to make mine known. The clip went viral within hours, not because of the outburst, but because of her response. Millions watched the video not for the drama, but for the dignity. For that rare moment where power wasn't defined by who could shout the loudest, but by who could remain grounded in the storm. Hashtags bloomed across social media, #CrockettCalm, #GraceUnderFire, #Lead like Jasmine, but the story doesn't end there. Because later that night, long after the cameras stopped rolling, Tim Scott knocked on Jasmine's office door. His tie was gone, and his eyes were bloodshot, not from anger, but from something older, tiredness, regret. Humanity, I shouldn't have yelled, he said quietly. Jasmine studied him. You didn't yell at me. You yelled at what I represent. He nodded. Maybe I did. I'm so tired of being told I'm not black enough, that I don't care. She sat back in her chair. And I'm tired of being told I'm too loud, too radical, too emotional. We all carry burdens, Tim, but yelling at each other won't lighten them. They talked for an hour. About childhood, about race, about policy, about how exhausting it was to be symbols instead of people. And somewhere in that conversation, something fragile and necessary was born. Not friendship, not yet. But respect. The two subplots that wound beneath this moment came into full relief over the following weeks. One involved Jasmine's longtime friend, Corey, a community organizer in Dallas who'd recently been arrested during a protest. His trial was turning into a media circus, and Jasmine was being pressured to distance herself from him. But she refused. In private calls, she advocated fiercely on his behalf, knowing that her political capital was on the line. If I lose my seat because I stood with someone who stands for justice, she told a colleague, then maybe I was never supposed to keep it. The second subplot revolved around Tim's secret efforts to reconnect with his estranged brother, Marcus, who had served time for drug charges and now worked 2 jobs just to stay afloat. Their relationship had always been strained. Marcus saw Tim's success as a betrayal. But the night after the hearing, Tim sent a text. I think I finally understand what you meant all those years ago. Can we talk? These threads mattered, not just because they revealed the stakes behind the politics, but because they showed that the real battles aren't fought in hearing rooms. They're fought in homes, in memories, in the quiet choices no one sees. The climax wasn't the yelling. It was the moment they chose to listen. A month later, Jasmine and Tim co-sponsored a bipartisan bill, focused not on flashy reforms, but on funding restorative justice programs, mental health support for formerly incarcerated individuals, and grant access for community-led safety initiatives. It wasn't perfect, it wouldn't solve everything. But it was a beginning, the lesson that strength isn't always volume, that courage doesn't always wear armor, that sometimes the most radical act in politics or in life is to pause, breathe, and choose empathy over ego. And maybe, just maybe, that's how change begins, not with a scream, but with a calm reply that echoes farther than anyone ever expected.